Hey, everybody. You're watching the Divided States of America show. I'm your host, Marlon Gardenera. I appreciate you tuning in. I'm back. I'm healthy. Took a couple days off, couple sick days. Feeling much better, ready to go. Happy to have you here. We're here Monday through Friday, noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Twitter. I appreciate you being here. Really, I do. Be sure and go to YouTube Live and watch us. You can catch past episodes there as well. You can subscribe. That's the best way to know when the show's coming back on. You can also share it with friends and family so we can grow this show and have great, thoughtful, respectful discussions about the divisive nature of our country. On today's show, we're talking term limits. I love the idea of term limits, except I don't trust or want to rely on Congress to impose them on themselves. I think there's another way, and I can't wait to spend time talking about that. But we have a little twist today. The Supreme Court may get term limits. A couple of people, liberals in Congress, have suggested that we add term limits. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about the terms. We'll talk about what you think today on the Divided States of America show.
Welcome to the Divided States of America show, where your host, Marlon Gardenera, takes on the most divisive issues in our divided nation. We'll sort through the best and worst of politics and culture, asking questions and looking for answers that our two-ring, two-party circus has failed to provide. And here is your host, Marlon Gardenera.
Hey, folks, I'm back. I appreciate, again, you tuning in today. It's an interesting day. Lots of news. Obviously, the interest rates have gone up 75 basis points to tackle inflation. Inflation is happening worldwide. Obviously, there's a connection between the supply chain, labor, from the pandemic. Certainly, Joe Biden gets the blame. I don't know that any one president can control that all, but he's at the helm. He's responsible. When things are going well, you get credit. When things aren't going well, you don't get credit. It's pretty simple. So he is the man at the center of it all. We'll see how that turns out. We'll talk inflation. We'll bring on a few economists later as we develop this program, and we'll get your opinion and find out how it's impacting you and how it's affecting your life. Likewise, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia apparently has come to an agreement with the Senate leader, Chuck Schumer from New York. So it looks like there may be some movement on climate and taxes. Obviously, once we have a better idea what that agreement is, it will be divisive. We'll be talking about it here. But I'm not here to regurgitate news. I do want to take on divisive issues in our divided nation. The concept or idea of we the people is something I think we've lost, and I wish we could get back there. Term limits is definitely one of the ways that I think that could happen. Again, I don't have trust or faith in Congress to impose them on themselves. But I think the idea of career politicians and people accumulating power and using that power, whether it be to stay in power, which I think most often is what's done, or to increase the strength of party and then use that machine. I don't know how often it represents who we are. And I certainly don't believe two parties represents who we are. It's really hard to pass the litmus test of any political party from A to Z. There are going to be things within that spectrum that you just don't agree with, or you may be more moderate on some and more conservative on others. I think we'd all be better off if there were more political parties and more pressure to address the differences among people in our country, not just A or B, not one side or the other. I've said this before. Can you imagine going through life with just two choices and you having the feeling you need to align with one in order to make any progress or get anything done? Well, I think term limits could make a big difference in that reality. Having said that, I don't think Congress is going to do it to themselves, but there is a proposal from Democrats, both in the Congress and the Senate, to put term limits on the Supreme Court. That, to me, is a very interesting concept. Don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But we'll talk a little bit about those things today, and I'm curious what you think. There's some public opinion polls, AP, and the Center for Public Affairs has done some research, and I was a little surprised at what the outcomes are. But the question obviously starts with comments that we heard from Elena Kagan. She is a more liberal Supreme Court justice sitting on the court now. You see her in this picture with Chief Justice John Roberts and President Obama, who nominated her. She is one of three more liberal justices on the court. We know there's a sixth more conservative justice majority. And her contention is that that does not reflect the makeup of America. It doesn't reflect the public. And that could have an impact on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. She said, we're warned that the Supreme Court legitimacy is at risk if it strays too far from public sentiment. I'll say it again, warns that, and this is Elena Kagan, one of the liberal justices, that Supreme Court legitimacy is at risk if it strays too far from the public sentiment. I don't know. Do we want a Supreme Court that reflects public sentiment at any given time? Certainly in our current system where it's a life appointment, that's impossible. Public sentiment changes and the Supreme Court justices don't necessarily change as quickly. There are people who've been on there for 35 plus years. There are people who, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed while sitting on the Supreme Court at much older ages. We know we have a new slew of much younger justices. But do you think the legitimacy of the Supreme Court has anything to do with its alignment with public sentiment? And I ask this because you would think in a democracy, the way it works and the president nominating and the Senate conferring and confirming and placing those justices, that what democracy wanted, you get through that process. But here we are in a situation where it didn't exactly work out that way. 4 of the 5 justices, or maybe 5 of 6, I'll look again in a minute, justices are there under what most people would call a unique circumstance. And surprisingly to me, based on the new poll, what people think of the Supreme Court, I have to be honest, I was surprised. So we'll get into that. But this is the current Supreme Court. They are doing things a little different than we've seen or had in the past, but that's because they have a 6-3 majority and they don't necessarily have to worry about all of the same things other courts have had to deal with. But that doesn't have our newest justice, Katana Jackson. We need to get an updated picture. But this is the makeup, the primary makeup of that court. And we're starting to see those results, starting with the Roe versus Wade being overturned. All right, going on for Kagan. I'm not talking about any particular decision or even any particular series of decisions. But if over time the court loses all connection with the public, I almost want to stop there. Yes, you are, in my opinion. She is talking about the most recent decisions. Roe versus Wade obviously is front and center when you start thinking about structural changes in the court. Being on the minority in a 6-3 majority obviously would get one thinking about how you could make change in that, and or maybe, with all sincerity, she's just trying to protect the integrity of the court as she sees it. I'm sure people in the majority think the integrity is just fine, although you'll be surprised when you hear some of the statistics surrounding that. I certainly know that I was. She said it's dangerous for democracy if there is that disconnection between the Supreme Court and the public. Now, it seems unusual to me that a Supreme Court justice would be talking about its legitimacy as she's sitting there and has to be one of the people making those decisions. And if you start to cut into the credibility of the decisions you have to make, it becomes an additional problem to public sentiment and what the public thinks is going on anyway. That's just a reality of our current Supreme Court. But it's real. It's happening. Now, here's that interesting fact that surprised me. Well, this is the makeup of the court, and you'll be surprised, despite this fact, where we're at. 5 of the 6 conservative justices on the bench were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. And they're now racing to impose their out-of-touch agenda on the American people who do not want it. Not my opinion, folks. Hank Johnson, a Democrat from Georgia. But it is interesting that 5 of the 6 conservative justices were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. So what I think Ms. Justice Kagan is trying to say is if 5 of the 6 that are there in that supermajority weren't put there by presidents who had the popular support of Americans, you can see how it's easily going to fall out of line with public sentiment. The justices in place don't represent, at least from a political party structure and who the president and Senate was at that time, the American public. They don't. They can't. They couldn't. The popular vote spoke to a different outcome. Now, we have a system that produces the outcome that we have, but I think this is the basis that they were referring to when they talk about the disconnect that we have between the public sentiment and the actual Supreme Court in place. Now, Kagan said all of this in a conference in Montana, but also said that the court earns its legitimacy by remaining impartial and nonpartisan. And I think this is the one that gets me the most. It's a joke if you think our Supreme Court is nonpartisan. It's a joke if you think they're sitting there completely impartial. They have no connection, not to party, not conservative, not to liberal, not Democrat, not Republican, not progressive, not whatever extreme you want to speak of to the conservative party. But they come in with preconceived ideas of how things should be determined, whether it be the originalists who think the Constitution as written should be applied, even though we know women didn't have rights, even though we know property owners were the only people who mattered and slaves didn't matter. So the true representation of the document really can't be applied today. But people who like that can say, we can change the Constitution. It is something that can be amended. So if times change, amend the Constitution to reflect that, but don't expect the original writing of it to change because it is as written. Great document, incredible insight, obviously some flaws in the people who actually wrote it, and they certainly couldn't predict that we'd be flying to the moon. Those types of things would make no sense. So I understand the divisive nature of that discussion. I really do. I understand how the idea of being impartial is supposed to be for a judge, but every time we go through these hearings, we see people digging and digging and digging to try to get answers. What side are you on? What do you actually believe? And because the determination of who gets confirmed is 100% political, it goes through our Senate, it starts with our president, it takes sides. I don't believe it's an impartial, nonpartisan body. They're put there by people who are both partial and partisan. How could it not? It's very rare, I think, that you're going to see a Supreme Court justice put in place that the people in power, the majority in the Senate, don't align with. So it's absolutely impartial and partisan. Partial and partisan. So that's why all this discussion is happening. If you're not aligned with the public, by virtue of 5 of the 6 conservative justices not being placed by presidents who even had the popular vote, and we know that polling goes against some of the decisions that have come out recently. And we know that because it's a very political appointment process and confirmation process, that people are going to be partial and partisan. They come in with preconceived notions. It's almost as if you can, determine what's going to be decided before, and it's just the politics of putting them there that really dictates what our Supreme Court is going to produce. I understand the disconnection with public sentiment. Now, here are some of the things that started to surprise me, though. It took me to a different place. And again, a group of House Democrats introduced a bill Tuesday to enact term limits for Supreme Court justices, arguing that the move will restore legitimacy and independence to the nation's highest court. Listen, the only reason I think that the House Democrats believe that it's not legitimate is because they're not in the majority. I'm not going to lie and try to make it seem like it's something other than that. I believe their motivation is that they're going to lose ideologically most of the decisions that come up while the court makeup looks the way it does. We know Justice John Roberts has done his best to try to keep balance and maybe even an effort to maintain legitimacy, and has been probably more open-minded on some issues than he might have otherwise. But again, there's a supermajority, and it's political, it's partisan, it's partial. So they think, House Democrats, and there's a senator who's introduced the same thing in the Senate, that it's what's going to restore legitimacy. I don't believe that. I believe it's legitimate, but disconnected from public sentiment. It's legitimate because we used the system that we're supposed to use. We did things the way they normally go. Yes, people have strong opinions about Mitch McConnell not letting Obama nominate people as the term came to an end. And then more recently, they didn't have any problem rushing a justice through, even though the term was coming to an end. We understand the hypocrisy of politics and politicians in general, both sides of the aisle. But do we really think that the legitimacy is destroyed because they have a majority? I would be more interested in the public sentiment. I would be more interested in the fact, yes, that 5 or 6 weren't put in with the popular vote. But I don't know if the wind is supposed to change the reality of the Supreme Court. What I would like to find, and politicians don't have the courage to do this, are actual impartial, nonpartisan judges. And maybe that's not possible. Maybe through the decisions that they've already made, you kind of get a glimpse of what they believe. But boy, I wish they could keep that closer to the cuff. And I wish the decisions reflected, their belief on the scenario and the case in front of them. But that it wasn't so carved out and so obviously one way or the other, such that we have the feeling that we have now. And people have that feeling. And this, quite frankly, is where I have been surprised where public sentiment actually is. The proposal to add term limits to the Supreme Court looks like this. They want presidents to nominate a new Supreme Court justice every 2 years. Doesn't matter if someone's come off the court, doesn't matter if someone's passed away, doesn't matter if someone's retired. Every 2 years, this proposal says that the president will nominate a Supreme Court justice and have to go through the confirmation process with the Senate. This would happen in the first and third year of a presidential term. So a president that serves 2 terms will have 4 nominees go potentially in front of the court. Now, the Senate obviously could change. It could turn over much faster than that. So the outcomes could potentially more often reflect public sentiment at that time if it happened every 2 years. Existing and new Supreme Court justices would have an 18-year term limit. An 18-year term limit. And I want to make sure that you're able to see this. Nominated every 2 years. The first and third year of a president's term, there would be 18-year term limits. I'm going to clear this out for you. 18-year term limits. And the longest serving justices would move to what would be called senior status. Senior status, once they are essentially bumped off because every 2 years, a new Supreme Court justice is added. With 9 justices, 2 years. The full term, if someone got in this policy, would be them serving for 18 years before they were bumped out by the continual nomination every 2 years in the first and third term of new justices. Now, the longest serving justices who get bumped out would become or get senior status. They still would be Supreme Court justices. They still would be paid. They would still maintain their office. And there would be things that they could do, like if one of the Supreme Court justices were ill and not able to participate, if one prematurely passed, in any circumstance where we were missing a Supreme Court justice, the justice that was most recently moved to senior status could go back in to the Supreme Court to maintain that 9-person court and to keep it odd, the odd number, and be able to move forward. So again, every 2 years, a president would nominate someone for the Supreme Court. It would happen in the first and third year of the term. There would be 18-year term limits so that as new ones come on, the most senior ones fall off. When they fall off, they go to the longest serving justices become or go to the senior status where they're still justices. They're just not active on the sitting court unless someone falls off and they are needed to go into place. I thought it was interesting. Now, being a proponent of term limits, I like the idea that the entrenched views of things may not continue to reflect the public sentiment. It may not continue to reflect the voting trends and democracy as we put it in. And apparently I'm not alone in that thinking. From the new AP poll with the Center for Public Affairs, 67% of Americans support term limits for the Supreme Court. I got to tell you, I was shocked to hear that number. I thought it would be as partisan as most things. I thought it would be as partisan as 90% of the things that we'll tackle on this show. I literally immediately thought Democrats would want it. Republicans would hate it. It would be a reflection of the current court. Current court should work for the people on the right because 6 of the 9 are on the right, and the 3 would hate it. Democrats who support the 3 liberal justices would think this is the greatest idea since sliced bread. Surprisingly, 67% of Americans support term limits for the Supreme Court. Now, this puts to the test one of the things that I've said all through the 3 or 4 weeks we've been going at it on this program. Even when you have a consensus, even when you have a supermajority in this country, I still think it's virtually impossible for us to actually make progress, even with a supermajority. Because the reality is Americans, 67%, more than 2/3, support term limits for the Supreme Court. But Congress, the people who put them there, the people who want to maintain their power, the people who want to put through what they believe, the people who think they're representing the American public, which they clearly weren't doing in Roe versus Wade. We know a majority of Americans support abortion, maybe with different restrictions and different timing, but a majority of them still do. And this is another example where 67% of Americans support something. But I'd be willing to bet, and I'll just do the gentleman's $1 bet, that our Congress, our Senate would never allow that to happen. And I hope I'm wrong. But here's the breakdown. 82% of Democrats are obviously for that. They don't like the current makeup of the court. But here is what blew my mind. 57% of Republicans surveyed agreed we should have term limits on the Supreme Court. Again, I would have bet everything that wouldn't be possible. So the idea that it's true, again, wow, just not something I anticipated, not something I expected. But that's where the American public is. Where are you? Now, based on the existence of the current Supreme Court, and these numbers have changed, particularly after Roe versus Wade, but it's still very telling. 17% of the American public that were surveyed believe, 17%, they have great confidence in the current Supreme Court. Great confidence in the way things are going. 17% of Americans. 34% of Americans have some confidence. Some confidence. But the last number has been on the rise steadily. 43% of Americans have hardly any confidence in the current Supreme Court. If that number gets above 50%, I wonder what American politics will look like. Again, we have 67% of Americans who think we should put term limits on the Supreme Court. I have no confidence that that's going to occur anytime in my lifetime. But it leads me to the one thing that I know that I'm going to be on, and I'm going to stay on it. I'm going to stay on it forever. As you consider the divisive issue, the Supreme Court as a whole, the 6-3 majority, 5 of the 6 being put in by presidents who didn't have the popular vote. So it being obvious how that could start to fall away from public sentiment, and how Justice Elena Kagan could start to think that the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is based on public support. Because can you imagine decisions coming out that a majority of the public just didn't like, and that happening continually? At some point, it does create a conflict, and it makes it really difficult to move forward on some issues. I think that it would be tumultuous if that continued at the pace, it looks like it may happen with the current makeup of the court. But term limits could solve it, and 67% of Americans want it. But here's something that I'm pushing for, and here's something that I'm going to bring up time and time again. I hope that this turns into an activist type show, but I don't want it to have activism for the left and the right as its motivation. What I want are the people in the middle, the people who go to work, take care of their kids, try to get a couple of weeks vacation, try to get a job with health benefits, try to get a job that provides a living wage, as the average person who just lives and just tries to exist, and they want to thrive, but they don't immerse themselves in the politics of the far left or the politics of the far right. Some of them try to avoid the news because they don't want to hear the spin, depending on what channel you're watching, or what station you're listening to, or what talk show host you have. My concept, my idea is called clean slate. We don't have to wait for Congress to impose term limits on themselves. Most of us don't believe they have the integrity or principle to do it, even though a majority of Americans would like to see it happen. Certainly there are Americans who like that their congressperson has been in office, their senator's been in office for 30 years, and they get money sent to their state, and they get the earmarks, and they get all these things that make it beneficial for their state, and certainly they should like it. But you also have the power dynamic that has people that, again, they're building the power dynamic more than they're building America. If they were building America, you wouldn't see, if you go to Twitter and you look at the House GOP and the House Democrats and the Senate GOP and the Senate Democrats and the campaigns, the parties themselves, if you watch the things they post, it couldn't be more divisive. It's as if they're leading the divide to attract as much attention and as many flies to either side just to win. It doesn't reflect that of our American population. If we're divided 50-50, how you could have no concern over a single concept or person on the other side makes you, 50% disingenuous. It makes you power hungry. It makes you think your job is more important than the other 50% of the population or the other people that you represent. It's disgusting to me. But the worst part is that the leadership is driving the divide on purpose. I know it's the game of politics. I know that's how it works. But folks, we're not doing better as a result of it. The all or nothing approach is horrible. Roe versus Wade is going to cause some real problems. It is. Some believe killing children, killing a fetus, causes problems as well. But we're not looking for that middle ground. You heard we talked about the 10-year-old who's probably not qualified to babysit your kids, but we're forcing that child to have a kid. You know I'm pro-life, but you know I'm also pro-staying out of your business. What I believe doesn't have to apply to you. But I think one of the ways that we can get to that is a clean slate. We don't have to wait for people to impose term limits on themselves. We can decide that 6 years, 3 terms in Congress is enough. We can decide, and I'm just throwing out numbers, 2 terms in the Senate, 12 years, it's enough. We can decide that and literally vote incumbents out when they reach that term. And here's the crazy part. The reason this partisan issue never moves anyway is the party in power doesn't want to disrupt that ever. But I'm not coming from a perspective of political parties. I'm coming from a perspective, if we had a clean slate, 3 terms for the Congress, 2 terms for the Senate, and you replaced them every single time, I'm not suggesting that you put in someone from the other party. If your state is predominantly Republican or conservative, and we don't evolve and add more parties and more interest and more dynamics so that people are better represented as opposed to having to pick one of 2, or even worse, just being independent and occasionally you sway it one way or the other, I'm suggesting if a Republican is what you want, put another Republican back in office. But don't allow them to make this about themselves. Don't allow them to be so power hungry that they're willing to rob Peter to pay Paul or trade values of the average American to maintain their power, because if they know they're leaving, they better maintain their effectiveness. Be effective, go on to the next office. If you're in Congress, be effective, go on to the Senate. Go on the Senate, you want to be effective, you think what you do or how you do it is effective, run for president. Literally. I'm going to spend a lot of time as we build this show, and once the show has the audience we want, talking about a clean slate campaign where we impose term limits. I'd love to know what you think about that. Feel free to comment. As usual, you know I appreciate you tuning into the show. I appreciate you letting me go on my rants. Hopefully my rants reflect that of the middle. The majority of the population that doesn't get caught up one way or the other, the part of the population that doesn't wake up in the morning and expect other people to follow what they think, the part of the population that wishes there was just respect for everyone and that there was compromise and ways to get some of what's important to more of us rather than all of what's important to few of us, which is probably the easiest way to say it. And that's what I think we have in our country right now. And that's what I think we need to get away from. I don't have any hesitation in saying that. This is the end of this episode. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciating you let me touch on the Clean Slate campaign, which you can anticipate me building and forming as time goes on. And I'm also curious again about your thoughts on the Supreme Court. 67% of Americans apparently believe, and even 57% of Republicans believe it. As usual, my question for you is, what do you think? You can always go to thedsashow.com and join us on the program. You can comment on Facebook, you can comment on Twitter, and you can comment on YouTube. We appreciate your feedback up to this point, and we're going to do everything we can to continue to build the show based on it. Again, I thank you for those who reached out to me and wished me well. I wasn't gravely ill, obviously. I just took 2 days, and here I am, and I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow's show, I have to tell you, is personal. Politics isn't always personal. Tomorrow is personal. Here in San Diego, the transplant games are coming this weekend. The transplant games are donors and recipients of organ transplants, organ, eye, and tissue donations. And they're competing in an Olympic-style competitions. They're coming out to celebrate the amazing miracle and power and the stories and the lives affected by organ donation. Now, I don't particularly think that that's a divisive issue. However, there are a lot of places where not even half of the population are donors. I know California is hovering around 17 million donors, but we have 35 million residents. So while it's not divisive where one party is taken aside and the other fights against it, there are still quite a few people who don't either understand what it is or don't believe it applies to them or don't believe it's something that they should be doing. And that to me is divisive because you have already heard I've had a transplant and I might not be here without one. Having said that, Friday's episode is going to be special. I'm going to try to break some of that gap I'm going to give you information that I want you to share, that I want people to become aware of as it relates to organ donation and how it at some point can impact your life. I have the good fortune of teaching at about, I don't know, I couldn't even remember how many schools I get to go to a year, how many ERs I get to go to, how many ICUs. I go to paramedic schools. I remind people that are a part of the process of organ donation how important they are. I would imagine my family thinks it was important. I would imagine the organizations I volunteer at, the people at my church, the people in my community where I try to make an impact could tell you at least one person, me, in the impact organ donation has had. On Friday, I'm going to spread the message. So I hope you come back tomorrow. I hope you watch that special episode. It's certainly special to me. But again, I appreciate you tuning in today. We're here Monday through Friday, noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, YouTube Live, Facebook Live, and Twitter. Podcast will be available very soon. I appreciate you sharing with friends. I'd love for you to go to YouTube and subscribe. But before anything else, please understand I appreciate your time and participation in the Divided States of America show.
Thanks for watching the Divided States of America show. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the channel and share this video with your family and friends.